Does your car run like a haunted shithouse?
That's because it's an Alotech.
No. Maybe. Well, if it does, it could be because of a number of reasons, such as vacuum leaks, blocked fuel injectors, or even dodgy spark plugs and ignition coils. When I back my car out of a morning, it likes to splutter a little bit and will sometimes even throw codes. I believe this is because of the spark plugs and the ignition coils, so we're going to fix that problem today.
But it's still going to be an Alotech.
Shut the fuck. We'll first have a look at all the parts we'll be using, which is 1 plenum gasket, 6 spark plugs and 6 ignition coils. I'll leave links in the description for all the parts that I used. Only a handful of tools are used in this project and they are all hand tools. Here we have a 10mm spanner, a ratchet with various sockets, a spark plug socket which in most cases is a 16mm, a breaker bar can be helpful for any tight bolts, and a torque wrench is recommended but honestly not that important for this job. We'll also need some screwdrivers, some channel locks or pliers, and a spark plug gapping tool. With all that collected, we can start on the project. I'm working on my 2006 Holden Commodore VZ. She just hit 100,000 K, so after this job it'll be also getting a quick service. The first step is to back it out of the shed and lift the bonnet. Unfortunately, mine isn't staying up because the gas struts are completely stuffed, so let's quickly change them. I'll put a stick under my bonnet to hold it up while I work. I can start by using a small screwdriver to move this little metal clip out, and then I can pull off the gas strut. Next, I'll use a T30 Torx bit to remove these 2 bolts at the bottom, and then we can compare the old and the new parts to make sure they are identical, followed by popping the new gas strut on and bolting it down to the frame. Then we can do the exact same thing to the other side and give it a test. It works perfectly, so now we can start the spark plugs. Use the 10mm spanner to remove the negative terminal of the battery and put it to one side. I normally wouldn't worry about this step, but since we are working with the car's electronics, it doesn't hurt to be safe. Next, I'll give the engine covers a quick pull upwards on both sides and they pop right off. The air intake tube can be removed with this 7mm socket, and don't do what I did and forget to take off this little clip down here, and you'll see why later on. These 2 tubes on either side of the plenum are next to take off, then this bracket can remove with a 10mm socket. The 10mm can be used once again to remove this little sensor at the back of the plenum, and then I'll remove the hoses that are also located back here. The main bolts for the plenum are next, and there are 6 to remove. 5 on the top and 1 at the back where that sensor was, and they can be removed with a 13mm socket. It is important to keep track of where these bolts go, as most of them are different lengths. With all 6 bolts removed, the plenum should come off pretty easily, but do it slowly and look around to make sure you've removed anything, and you'll see here that I've got to take that clip off. Make sure you place a lint free cloth over the inlets because you really don't want any crap to falling in there. We just had to remove all these parts to get to the spark plugs, and that's because it's a f***ing dumb design. I forgot to film it, but unclip the connector on the top of the ignition coil and use a 10mm socket to remove the bolt. Now this bolt is a captive bolt, which means that it won't remove from the coil. So when it's loose, just give it a good pull upwards and the ignition coil will come right out. Grab a spark plug socket and remove the spark plug. I had to use a breaker bar first because they were in there tight. Once they are removed, cover up the hole and go over to the new spark plugs. Here we can compare the old versus the new to make sure that they are identical. Have a look at the spark plug chart like the back of the one on this repair manual to see if they're good enough to go back in. Judging by my old spark plugs with a bit of a cleanup, they'd be fine to go back into the car. But with that being said, if one of your spark plugs is bad, it is recommended to change them all. But I want to change them all anyway, as they're a huge pain to get to on my car. Some spark plugs come pre-gapped, but these ones did not. They have a gap of 0.9mm, whereas they need to be from 1.1mm to 1.2. So I'll be using this little lip on the gapping tool, and we can gently pry it out and test the gap. Make sure you only go in little increments, because while you can tap it back in, if you go too far, you really don't want to stretch this metal too much. With the gap on the spark plugs all set, we can thread them back into the block. Some spark plugs thread in better with a little bit of oil or anti-seize on the threads, but this brand that I'm using says not to use any, so they're going in dry. When it's snug with ratchet, I got the torque wrench out and turned it to 16 Newton meters. I forgot to film it again, but push the ignition coil in until you can't push no more, and then tighten down the 10mm bolt and connect the wiring clip. Then once that is all done, it's time to do it 5 more times around the engine. After all the plugs and coils are changed, I scraped off the old gasket. It's recommended to use a plastic scraper, but the stock paper gasket was really stuck down there, so Dad and I used a sharp wood chisel and scrape it off really gently. This method is definitely not recommended, as the metal can scratch the block and cause a leak, but I couldn't get it off any other way. I used some RTV gasket maker to go around all the inlets, even though I have a metal gasket, but doing this process just adds peace of mind, as air can seep in if the rubber seals on the metal gasket don't seal too well. I put the metal gasket in place and they have locator pins to make it super easy to line up. Then I put some more RTV on the underside of the plenum. Lining this up can be a challenge, especially when you have a camera in the road, but having a second person and the 2 bolts in the middle helps a lot to line it up right. With that on, I can bolt down the bolts until they become tight, but the RTV needs 1 hour to cure before it can be torqued into spec at 23 Newton meters. While I'm waiting for this hour to finish, we can connect up the rest of the hoses and connectors, and then spend the rest of the time following me on Instagram and watching some of my other videos. When they all torque down, you can reattach the negative terminal off the battery, and then it's time to give it a test.
Ready?
I believe that god-awful noise at the start was the computer adjusting, as that was the only time it ever did that, but I took it for a quick test drive and it ran and is running perfectly right now. The next day I did a quick service on the car, which involved changing the oil in the oil filter, changing the air filter and topping up the coolant. Then I went inside the car and retuned the head unit to work with the steering wheel controls, then clicked the service message on the dash by holding down the 2 arrow buttons and turning it into the run position. Then, after the beep, holding the set button, and after that, the job was all done.
Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments or send me a message on Instagram and I'll do my very best to answer them. With that being said, make sure you follow me over on Instagram to stay up to date with everything I'm working on, including a few more projects to do on this Commodore. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.